What if Gennady Zyuganov won the 1996 Russian presidential election? In our own timeline, Boris Yeltsin was the president of the Russian Federation from its declaration of independence on December 12, 1991 to his resignation on Sylvester Eve 1999. His successor would be Vladimir Putin, who reigns with an iron fist to this day, but before that, Boris Yeltsin had to face an election campaign in 1996 against communist Gennady Zyuganov. Yeltsin was extremely unpopular as his time in office was plagued with economic and political instability, a defeat in Chechnya and Russia's fall from grace, and it seemed like Zyuganov would actually win the election. Unfortunately for Zyuganov, Yeltsin had a trump card in form of the Russian oligarchs, who were anxious of a communist president and essentially funded Yeltsin's campaign and spent a lot of money on ads to make Zyuganov look bad. In the end, nobody won in the first round, but in the second, Yeltsin won by 54.4% against Zyuganov's 40.73%. But what if that didn't happen? What if Gennady Zyuganov won the 1996 Russian presidential election? In this timeline, the smear campaign of the oligarchs doesn't work and even results in disdain towards Yeltsin, as he is seen as a puppet of the oligarchs, while Zyuganov is seen as caring for the rest of the nation. In the final results of the second round, Gennady Zyuganov won 50.73%, while Boris Yeltsin won just 44.4%. With that, Gennady Zyuganov would become president of the Russian Federation. Right upon taking office, he would strengthen the power of the presidency and slowly erode democracy in Russia, not all too different to Vladimir Putin in our own timeline. As he said himself, he'd make the office of the Russian presidency twice as strong as that of France, and 4 times as strong as the POTUS. But he probably wouldn't stop there. In 1999, the state of Russian democracy is just a facade, and the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, or CPRF, won a majority of seats in the Duma. He would then win the presidential election of 2000 in a landslide, one that the West would call rigged. During the election, the Second Chechnya War still continues, and just like Putin, he would be able to consolidate the region. Economically speaking, the power of the oligarchs is stripped off and privatization is reversed, with Russia returning to communism. He would try to emulate Dengism from China, which may or may not bring success. In 2002, the 80th anniversary of the formation of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation is replaced with the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, officially making the country communist. The Duma is replaced with the Supreme Soviet, of which all members are from the Communist Party, while he himself becomes the chairman. With him recreating the RSFC, it is clear to everyone that he wants to recreate the whole Soviet Union, which was intensified when the Republic of Belarus changed its name to the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. This fear of the Soviet Union would push many countries of the former Soviet Union just further to the west. In 2004, the Baltics would join NATO, and Chairman Zyuganov would decry that the imperialist West is trying to expand right on Russia's doorstep. Even though Zyuganov is just as anti-Western, conservative and religious as Putin, his rule would be weaker. Putin essentially got full support from the far left and the far right, while Zyuganov would lack that far right support. He would also have to deal with a louder center, as unlike Putin, he doesn't pretend to uphold the Russian Federation. Furthermore, Russian exports for 2 decades have been oil and gas exports to Europe, which is less likely with a communist Russia, and thus the West is more opposed to Russia. This can be especially seen in the United States. Whereas in our own timeline, Republicans are soft on Russia, here both Democrats and Republicans would be just as aggressive to Russia as they are to China. In 2008, Russia would still invade Georgia, but here the West, while not directly intervening, they support Georgia more. In the end, a peace deal is signed in which both Russian and Georgian troops withdrawing and peacekeeping troops going in. Both Abkhazia and South Ossetia would hold a referendum whether they want independence or join Georgia, with both seeking independence. This did end the war, but soon later a communist coup in both of these would result in pro-Zyuganov regimes there. Nonetheless, Georgia is in NATO in this timeline, as they don't have border disputes here. In this timeline, with Russia being perceived as much more of a threat, Obama, who is seen as too soft and too much of a lefty, loses to hawk Mitt Romney from the Republican column. It is even possible that he is perceived as too radical in 2000, 2008 and Hillary wins the Democratic primary. She'd still defeat McCain but still loses to Romney. In 2014 Russia would still invade Crimea, following Euromaidan. But here with Romney in power, the United States does more to prevent Russia from obtaining Crimea. In our own timeline Russia had aims towards Ukraine, but after Crimea turned out to be more difficult than expected, they settled for Crimea for now. With massive Western support for Ukraine, Russia could end up being forced to leave Ukraine, which would be a huge humiliation for Zyuganov. Ukraine would then join NATO. This would be a point of weakness for Gennady Zyuganov, and his opposition would finally rise up in the so-called Second Russian Civil War. Just like before, it consists of communist Reds and anti-communist Whites. These are then divided into liberals, ultranationalists, oligarchs, militarists, fascists and monarchists. The West would likely somewhat support the Whites, while China would support Zyuganov and his regimes. Zyuganov has an advantage in that his Reds are united, while the Whites face infighting just like a century earlier, and so I believe Zyuganov would remain in power and eventually win the civil war. But during the civil war Russia would once again lose its sphere, as for example Western support for the Syrian opposition topples Assad almost a decade earlier than in our own timeline. It is also possible that the West would support a coup against Lukashenko, leading to a more democratic and Western Belarus that probably joins NATO as well. In the Caucasus too, Armenia and Azerbaijan would seek to join NATO but would first have to settle their border dispute, which considering Azerbaijan's strength over Armenia and support from Turkey would be settled in their favor, while Georgia might invade Abkhazia and South Ossetia. In the northern Caucasus, we could also see ethnic minorities trying to gain independence like the Chechens. By the time the civil war ends in the late 2010s or early 2020s, Russia is much weaker on the global stage and can almost be referred to as a Chinese vassal, especially after China takes effective, but unofficial control of Outer Manchuria. Just like in the 90s, Russia is no longer a great power, except that the situation in Russia is even worse, and they are now a client of a nation that just 1.5 centuries ago was inferior to Russia. NATO is now in effectively the entirety of Eastern Europe. It is also unlikely for someone like Trump to become president, as nobody really wants to return to isolationism with communism still big and strong in Moscow, and because of 2 successful terms of Mitt Romney, which are likely followed by a moderate Democrat. In this timeline Russia would become authoritarian 4 years earlier, but under a communist regime that aims to reunify the Soviet Union only for it to fail and Russia to fall to civil war once more. In the end Russia only plays second fiddle to China, and the West has expanded all the way to Belarus and Ukraine, leaving Russia not a single buffer between itself and the West. If you liked the episode, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.